Hello, my name's David Guest and I'm a ThirdSpace solution architect. I'm going to talk to you today about ADFS to Azure Authentication, migrating from one service to another. Before I start, it's worth looking at a little bit of history. Microsoft brought out Office 365 back in June 2011. Before that, it had been around in a couple of flavours, mostly around BPOS. Identities were linked to your on-premises Active Directory using DirSync, and authentication could be done either cloud-based or using ADFS. ADFS was the only way in those days that we could actually get single sign-on, allowing users within a domain to actually access the Office 365 services without having to sign in again. Very simply, if your domain joined PC was on the network and you signed into Active Directory, you could gain access very easily. If you were outside, ADFS would prompt you for your ID and password and then allow you to sign in automatically. That way everything was nice and straightforward. It made access easy for the users. If they were being asked for an ID and password, then it was the same ID and password. If they were inside the building, they'd just get seamless access all the way through. But over time, those authentication systems have changed. As well as ADFS, we now also have pass-through authentication, password hash sync, and we can still use an external federation. Making the choice as to which one of those is the best way to go is something that should really be done right at the start. But things do change, and we need to be aware of that when we're looking to the future. Hybrid identity involves us having both the on-premises and cloud identity in sync. And when we're looking at what we need to do in terms of that authentication, we need to consider the time it takes from a user's perspective, but also from an administration perspective. What's the complexity of doing something? Do we require additional servers? What's the cost of keeping this up to date? Rolling over certificates where required. Every organisation is different, and the requirements of this will change over time. If we go back to 2011, many people were not happy with putting a hash of a password in the cloud, in case, of course, the whole system was compromised. These days, with the NCSC recommending that the best way to do Office 365 is actually to use the password hash synchronization, then we're in a totally different place. And that's why we now are seeing an awful lot of people doing this ADFS to Azure Authentication. But it could also be about performance. Because when we sign into Azure Active Directory and therefore Office 365, we're actually being redirected to ADFS. A web page is being presented before the user can actually sign in. With password hash sync and PTA, there is no secondary redirection. The prompt for ID and then password comes directly from Azure. And that can give you a huge increase in performance. An ADFS page could take something like 4 seconds to arrive from where it was initiated at a service provider level. A password hash sync, or PTA, on the same box using Firefox will take less than 1.5 seconds. And there are differences between these authentications, but there probably are less than you think. If we're doing a cloud-only authentication, then we don't need to worry about single sign-on. But with password hash sync, or pass-through authentication, or federation, we can get a form of single sign-on to work. With ADFS and third-party providers, it relies on us having some on-premises hardware. Pass-through authentication does rely on a piece of software sitting on your directory servers so that it can do the authentication, where password hash sync has no reliance on on-premises hardware at all. Yes, I suppose you could say there is an issue with an AD Connect box must be in place in order to synchronize the passwords, but that's it. That really gives us the least deployment effort. We don't actually have to do anything more than install a Azure AD Connect in the right configuration. If we compare that to a true federation, where we can have an on-premises multi-factor authentication service provided by non-Microsoft, then that's something that only something like ADFS can do. But it's still worthwhile, even with third parties, making sure that we have password hash sync enabled. And that's because it gives us a lot of options then to actually understand leaked credentials. Identity protection, to work at its best, requires not only the identities in the cloud, but also the password hashes. But if we look at this as a matrix of what services are available and when, we can actually see that most of the services that users would want are available either with password hash sync or with PTA. The main difference being that PTA doesn't require a password in the cloud and uses a lightweight agent, but you still need password hash sync if you want to do identity protection. ADFS allows you to use third-party MFA providers linked to the ADFS box, should you wish to go that way. Now, once we've moved the authentication for Office 365 away from ADFS, there may be some other things left behind. Other services may be using ADFS for authentication. That could be other cloud services that the users are accessing. One by one, these can each be migrated from ADFS to Azure Active Directory. That may in some cases require quite a lot of investment in terms of moving the software across. In this case though, we won't see that as part of the initial switchover. It should be seen as a follow-on project. The aim of this initial project is to take the users and get them to authenticate in the cloud, giving us that foundation for migrating away from ADFS. So when we actually look at how you migrate from Federation, well, there's a number of things we have to do. You're probably talking about making a tenant-wide change. You wouldn't want to have some of your users using seamless single sign-on and others using ADFS. Although we can switch it domain by domain, you will eventually end up with everybody using the same system. We need to turn on password hash synchronization first to make sure that the passwords are in the right place, and then switch the Azure-based services to using that. To do that, we put together a migration plan. Initially, discover the configuration you've got in place today. How does it work? What elements are in place? Have you added any complexity to the Azure AD Connect? We then need to do some configuration. Make sure that the passwords are in the right place. Make sure that the domain can be defederated easily. Test it and make sure that the users are able to sign in. Once it's done, pass out the group policies that are required to provide the seamless single sign-on, document and make sure that the information on how this is all built is transferred over to you. And that's what we'll be doing as ThirdSpace, working with you to understand the deployment, planning the changeover, documenting each of the steps that's required in order to carry out that switchover, and then supporting you once the switchover is complete to make sure that any problems that come up can be dealt with quickly and in a timely manner. If you'd like some more information on any of this, please give us a call. You'll be able to get us on the usual numbers, details of which are on the screen. And thank you for listening.